The room fell silent. The air crackled with tension as Mr. Grayson, the strictest teacher at Lincoln Middle School, stared down at Ethan, the quiet boy who rarely spoke. "You think you're smarter than me, huh?" Mr. Grayson sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. Ethan didn't respond. His eyes, calm and steady, locked with Mr. Grayson's. The class watched, stunned, as the teacher's face twisted in frustration. "Fine," Mr. Grayson barked. "Let's settle this." He turned to the board and scribbled an impossibly complex equation. "Solve this in less than 5 minutes, genius," he challenged. "If you're so smart, prove it." Ethan stood from his seat, his slight frame dwarfed by the towering man. The class held their breath. What happened next left everyone speechless. Ethan didn't walk to the board. Instead, he began reciting the answer aloud, step by step, breaking down the equation faster than anyone could process. Each word was precise, his tone unwavering. By the time he finished, Mr. Grayson's face was pale. Ethan had not only solved the problem, but had also corrected a mistake in the teacher's setup. How did you do that?" Mr. Grayson stammered. Ethan shrugged. "You made an error," he said softly, pointing to the board. "Right here." Before Mr. Grayson could respond, the principal entered the room. "Mr. Grayson," she said sharply, "a word in my office." "Now." The class erupted in whispers as Mr. Grayson stormed out, leaving Ethan standing alone. A week earlier, Ethan had been invisible to most of the school. He was the boy who sat in the back, kept his head down, and avoided attention. Teachers barely noticed him, and students often forgot he was there. But for some reason, Mr. Grayson had taken a particular interest in making Ethan's life difficult. It started small, calling on him when he knew Ethan wouldn't answer, criticizing his work for minor mistakes, and even mocking his quiet nature in front of the class. Ethan endured it without complaint, but the cracks in his calm exterior began to show. One day, during a math lesson, Mr. Grayson caught Ethan quietly scribbling in a notebook. "Ethan," he barked, "care to share what's so fascinating?" Ethan hesitated, but eventually walked to the front with his notebook. The class snickered as Mr. Grayson snatched it from his hands. "What's this?" Mr. Grayson flipped through the pages, his scorn turning to confusion. It was filled with complex equations and diagrams far beyond their grade level. "Where did you copy this from?" "I didn't copy it," Ethan replied quietly. "I was just working on some problems." Mr. Grayson laughed. "Don't lie to me, boy. No middle schooler can do this. Did your parents do this for you?" Ethan's face burned with humiliation. "No, sir. I figured it out myself." That moment set the stage for what would become a week of relentless challenges. Mr. Grayson seemed determined to expose Ethan as a fraud. He assigned him extra problems, called him to the board daily, and made snide remarks whenever Ethan succeeded. The final straw came during a class quiz. Mr. Grayson had purposely added a trick question, confident Ethan would fail. When Ethan finished first and handed in his paper, Mr. Grayson smirked. "Let's see how our genius did." The teacher graded it on the spot, his face falling with each correct answer. Ethan had scored perfectly. This can't be right," Mr. Grayson muttered. "You cheated." The class gasped. Ethan's calm demeanor cracked. "I didn't cheat," he said, louder than anyone had ever heard him speak. "Why do you hate me so much?" The room froze. Mr. Grayson was speechless, caught off guard by the outburst. "Enough," the teacher finally shouted. "Detention. After school." Ethan didn't argue. He sat down, his face unreadable. But something had changed in him. The quiet boy was no longer willing to stay silent. The next day, Ethan entered the classroom with a determined look. Mr. Grayson wasted no time, challenging him in front of the class. "Since you're so brilliant, why don't you solve this?" he sneered, pointing to a new equation on the board. And that was the moment it all came crashing down for Mr. Grayson. Back in the present, the principal's office door slammed shut. Inside, the principal's voice could be heard, sharp and unwavering. Meanwhile, Ethan returned to his seat, ignoring the stares of his classmates. The school would never be the same after that day. Ethan may have won the battle, but the war was far from over. Mr. Grayson wasn't the type to let a student outsmart him without retaliation. Ethan knew it, too. What he didn't know was how far Mr. Grayson would go to regain his pride. The question wasn't if there would be a reckoning, but when. The aftermath of that day was like a storm brewing in silence. Ethan's classmates whispered his name in awe, some with admiration, others with jealousy. For the first time in his life, Ethan was the center of attention. But he hated it. He wanted to fade back into the background where no one bothered him. Mr. Grayson returned to class the following day with a forced smile and an edge to his voice that everyone noticed. He began the lesson as if nothing had happened, but his eyes frequently darted to Ethan, who kept his gaze down and worked quietly. But the calm didn't last long. "Ethan," Mr. Grayson said suddenly, his tone smooth but with an underlying bite. "Would you mind staying after class? I'd like to discuss your future in this subject." The class exchanged knowing looks. Ethan simply nodded, his face betraying no emotion. When the bell rang, Ethan stayed seated as the room emptied. Mr. Grayson shut the door behind the last student, leaning against it with his arms crossed. "You're quite the celebrity now, aren't you?" Mr. Grayson started, pacing slowly. "Everyone's talking about how the quiet boy showed up the teacher. Is that what you wanted?" "No, sir," Ethan replied, his voice steady. "Then what is it?" Mr. Grayson pressed. "Are you trying to humiliate me? Show me up in front of the class?" Ethan shook his head. "I wasn't trying to do anything. You keep calling me out." "I just answered." Mr. Grayson's smile twisted into a smirk. "You think you're smarter than me, don't you?" Ethan hesitated, then met his teacher's gaze. "I think I'm good at math," he said simply. The reply seemed to anger Mr. Grayson more. "Well, let's see how good you are," he said, pulling a thick book from his desk. He flipped through it before slamming it down in front of Ethan. "Solve the hardest problem in here. No calculators, no notes. Right now." Ethan glanced at the book. The problem was from an advanced college-level textbook, something no middle schooler should be expected to understand. But instead of backing down, Ethan picked up a pencil and started working. His brow furrowed in concentration as he filled the page with calculations. Mr. Grayson leaned over him, watching every move. He was waiting for Ethan to fail, to stumble, to admit defeat. But the boy didn't. After 15 minutes of silence, Ethan pushed the paper across the desk. "Done." Mr. Grayson snatched it up, his eyes scanning the work. His face reddened as he realized the boy was right again. "How do you know all this?" Mr. Grayson demanded. "This isn't normal." Ethan hesitated. He didn't want to explain his late nights spent poring over math books, his love of solving puzzles, or how numbers felt like the only thing in the world that made sense. Instead, he shrugged. "I just like math." "Get out," Mr. Grayson snapped, tossing the paper aside. "And don't think this is over." Ethan left the classroom feeling a mix of relief and dread. He knew Mr. Grayson wasn't letting this go, but he didn't understand why the teacher hated him so much. At lunch, Ethan sat alone, as usual. He pulled out a book and tried to lose himself in it, but the noise around him was hard to ignore. "Hey, math genius," a voice called. Ethan looked up to see Logan, one of the class troublemakers, grinning at him. "Heard you made Grayson look like an idiot." Ethan said nothing, hoping Logan would get bored and leave. "Come on, man. Don't be shy." Logan plopped into the seat across from him. "That was awesome. You should do it again." "It's not a competition," Ethan muttered, returning to his book. "Could have fooled me," Logan said with a laugh. "Grayson's out for blood now. You better watch your back." Ethan glanced at him, surprised by the warning. Logan wasn't the type to care about anyone but himself. "Why do you care?" Ethan asked. "I don't," Logan admitted. "But I'd hate to see you crash and burn. It'd ruin the show." Ethan sighed, closing his book. "I'm not trying to fight him." "Could have fooled me," Logan repeated, standing up. "Good luck, genius. You'll need it." The rest of the week passed uneventfully, or so it seemed. Mr. Grayson stopped singling Ethan out during class, though his gaze lingered on the boy whenever he walked by. Ethan tried to ignore it, focusing on his work and keeping his head down. But one morning, he arrived at school to find a note waiting for him in his locker. It was typed, with no name or signature, but the message was clear. "You're not as smart as you think. Stop showing off, or you'll regret it." Ethan's stomach sank. He looked around the hallway, but no one seemed to be paying him any attention. He folded the note and shoved it into his pocket, his mind racing. Who had sent it? Mr. Grayson? One of the students? Was it just a prank? Or was someone actually trying to scare him? By the time Ethan reached math class, he was on edge. He slid into his seat, glancing at Mr. Grayson, who was writing on the board. The teacher's expression was calm, almost too calm, and Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. And then it did. "Class," Mr. Grayson said, turning to face them, "I have a special assignment for you today." A group project. The class groaned, but Ethan's heart sank. He hated group projects. They always meant working with people who didn't understand him or, worse, made fun of him. "You'll be paired randomly," Mr. Grayson continued, holding up a list, "and your task is to solve a set of advanced problems together. This will count for a significant portion of your grade, so I suggest you take it seriously." He began reading off the pairs, and Ethan's dread grew with each name. When Mr. Grayson finally reached his, the teacher's lips curled into a faint smirk. "Ethan, you're with Logan." Ethan's stomach dropped. Logan, the class troublemaker who seemed to live for chaos, was the last person he wanted to work with. The boy in question grinned as he slid into the seat next to Ethan. "This is gonna be fun," Logan said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Ethan said nothing, his mind already spinning. He couldn't tell if this was some kind of punishment, a coincidence, or part of a larger plan. But one thing was certain. Mr. Grayson wasn't done with him yet. Ethan stared at the problems on the paper in front of him, Logan leaning back in his chair with a mischievous grin, and Mr. Grayson watching them both like a hawk. The tension in the room is palpable, and Ethan knows this is just the beginning of whatever game the teacher is playing. Ethan stared at the problem sheet, his mind racing. The questions were deliberately convoluted, far beyond the scope of what anyone in the class could reasonably solve. It was obvious this wasn't about testing their knowledge. It was a setup. "All right, genius," Logan said, leaning back in his chair with a smirk. "What's the plan? You solve everything while I sit here and look pretty?" Ethan didn't respond immediately. He knew Logan wasn't going to be helpful, and worse, he had a feeling Logan would make things harder on purpose. But he didn't want to give Mr. Grayson the satisfaction of seeing him struggle. "I'll start with the first one," Ethan said quietly. "If you don't want to help, just stay out of my way." Logan let out a low whistle. "Wow, bossy. All right, suit yourself." He leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand as he watched Ethan work. "But don't expect me to save you when Grayson tears you apart." Ethan ignored him, focusing on the first problem. The numbers danced across the page, forming patterns in his mind. He quickly jotted down equations, his pencil moving in smooth, confident strokes. By the time he finished, Logan was staring at him with raised eyebrows. "Did you actually just solve that?" Logan asked, sounding genuinely impressed. "Yes," Ethan said without looking up. "Now, do you want to check my work, or are you just going to sit there?" Logan laughed. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But nah, I'm good. Keep going, Einstein." Ethan sighed and moved on to the next problem. The room was filled with the sound of scribbling pencils and murmured conversations as other groups worked on their assignments. Mr. Grayson wandered between desks, pausing occasionally to glance at Ethan and Logan. Every time his shadow fell over their table, Ethan's heart pounded. "Everything all right here?" Mr. Grayson asked, his voice dripping with feigned concern. "Yes, sir," Ethan replied without looking up. "Good," Mr. Grayson said, his gaze lingering on the paper in front of Ethan. "Remember, this is a group project. Both partners should contribute." Ethan clenched his jaw but didn't respond. Logan, to his surprise, actually spoke up. "Oh, don't worry, Mr. Grayson. I'm contributing plenty. Moral support, you know?" The class snickered, and Mr. Grayson's lips tightened. "Just make sure you turn in something worth grading," he said before moving on. Ethan waited until Mr. Grayson was out of earshot before glaring at Logan. "Can you at least pretend to care?" "Relax," Logan said, raising his hands defensively. "You're doing fine on your own. Why mess with a good thing?" Ethan shook his head and returned to the problems. He was halfway through the sheet when he noticed something odd. The fourth question didn't make sense. The numbers didn't add up, and the instructions were vague. He frowned, tapping his pencil against the desk. "What's the holdup?" Logan asked, leaning over to look at the paper. "This question is wrong," Ethan said quietly. "Wrong?" Logan snorted. "You're kidding, right? Grayson's too much of a control freak to make a mistake." Ethan didn't reply. He studied the problem again, running the numbers in his head. The more he looked at it, the more certain he became. The question wasn't just difficult, it was unsolvable. By the time the bell rang, Ethan had completed most of the assignment, except for the faulty question. Logan stretched and yawned, clearly bored out of his mind. "Well, that was fun. Let me know how it turns out, Einstein." Ethan packed up his things, his mind still on the flawed problem. He knew he couldn't leave it alone. If he turned in the assignment as it was, Mr. Grayson would use the unsolved question against him. But if he pointed out the error, it might make things worse. As he walked home, Ethan's unease grew. He couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Grayson had set him up. The teacher's smirk, the impossible question, the random pairing with Logan. It all felt too calculated. When he got home, Ethan spread out the problem sheet on his desk. He spent hours trying to find a solution, but no matter what approach he took, the numbers refused to cooperate. Frustrated, he grabbed a fresh piece of paper and wrote a detailed explanation of why the question was flawed, complete with diagrams and examples. If Mr. Grayson wanted to play games, Ethan would show him he wasn't going to back down. The next day, Ethan handed in the assignment with a mixture of dread and defiance. He didn't look at Mr. Grayson as he placed the paper on the teacher's desk, but he felt the man's eyes on him. "Good luck," Logan said with a grin as they parted ways after class. "I think you're gonna need it." Ethan barely slept that night, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Would Mr. Grayson accuse him of cheating again? Would he mark the entire assignment as wrong just to punish him? The possibilities were endless, and none of them were good. When Ethan walked into math class the following morning, the atmosphere was tense. Mr. Grayson stood at the front of the room, holding a stack of papers. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes locked onto Ethan the moment he entered. "Take your seats," Mr. Grayson said, his voice unusually sharp. The class quickly settled down, sensing that something was about to happen. Mr. Grayson began handing back the graded assignments, his face giving away nothing as he moved from desk to desk. When he reached Ethan, he paused, holding the paper just out of reach. "Well, Ethan," Mr. Grayson said, his tone almost mocking, "let's see how your group did." Ethan took the paper, his hands shaking slightly. His heart sank when he saw the large red B scrawled across the top. A note in the margin read, "Incomplete. Question 4 not answered correctly." Ethan's head shot up. But it was wrong, he blurted out before he could stop himself. The question didn't make sense. The class went silent. Mr. Grayson raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" The question, Ethan repeated, his voice steadier now. "It couldn't be solved. I explained why in my notes." Mr. Grayson's eyes narrowed. "Are you saying I made a mistake?" The tension in the room was unbearable. Ethan knew he was walking a fine line, but he couldn't back down. "Yes," he said firmly. "I am." Mr. Grayson's face darkened, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of his desk. "Stay after class," he said coldly. The bell rang moments later, but Ethan didn't move. As the classroom emptied, he braced himself for what was coming. Mr. Grayson closed the door and turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" the teacher said, his voice low and menacing. Ethan didn't answer. He stood his ground, his heart pounding in his chest. "Let me tell you something, boy," Mr. Grayson continued, stepping closer. "You might be good with numbers, but in the real world, people like you don't get far by making enemies." Ethan clenched his fists, his fear giving way to anger. "I'm not trying to make enemies," he said quietly. "I just want to be treated fairly." Mr. Grayson laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Fair? Life isn't fair, kid. The sooner you learn that, the better." Ethan stared at him, his mind racing. He didn't know what Mr. Grayson was planning, but he could feel the weight of the man's resentment pressing down on him. And then, without warning, Mr. Grayson grabbed the problem sheet and tore it in half. "Let's see you prove your point now," he said with a cruel smile. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The teacher had just destroyed the evidence of the flawed question, and with it, any chance Ethan had of defending himself. Ethan stood frozen, staring at the shredded pieces of paper on the desk. Mr. Grayson's smirk deepened as he leaned closer. "What's the matter? No comeback this time?" Ethan's mind raced. He felt trapped, but he refused to let panic consume him. Slowly, he straightened his back, meeting Mr. Grayson's glare with quiet determination. "I don't need the paper to prove my point," he said calmly. "I have everything written in my notebook." Mr. Grayson's smirk faltered for a split second before he recovered. "Oh, do you now? How convenient." Ethan nodded. "You can check it if you want." Mr. Grayson's expression turned icy. "I've had enough of your games, Ethan. Get out of my classroom." Ethan hesitated. "But now." Mr. Grayson's voice boomed, echoing through the empty room. Ethan grabbed his bag and left, his head spinning. As he walked down the hallway, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Mr. Grayson was trying to intimidate him, but Ethan wasn't going to let him win. Not this time. That evening, Ethan sat at his desk, flipping through his notebook. He carefully rewrote his explanation of the flawed question, adding more details and double-checking his calculations. He wanted to be absolutely certain that there were no errors. Once he was satisfied, he scanned the pages using his dad's old printer and emailed the file to the principal with a short message. Subject: concern about assignment grading. Dear Principal Johnson, I'm writing to bring something to your attention. On the most recent assignment in Mr. Grayson's class, one of the questions was unsolvable due to a flaw in its setup. I explained this in my notes, but my grade was still penalized. I've attached my work for review. Thank you for your time. Sincerely, Ethan Turner. Ethan hit send and closed his laptop. He didn't know what would happen next, but he felt a small sense of relief. At least he had taken action. The next morning, Ethan walked into school feeling a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. He kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with his classmates as he made his way to math class. When he entered the room, he immediately noticed the tension in the air. Mr. Grayson was already at his desk, his face tight with barely concealed anger. Ethan took his seat, trying to ignore the teacher's piercing glare. The lesson began as usual, but Ethan couldn't focus. He kept glancing at the clock, counting down the minutes until the end of class. Finally, the bell rang. As the students packed up their things, Mr. Grayson called out, "Ethan, stay behind." Ethan's stomach dropped, but he nodded and remained seated. Once the room was empty, Mr. Grayson shut the door and turned to face him. "Do you think I don't know what you've done?" the teacher hissed. Ethan blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" "Don't play dumb with me," Mr. Grayson snapped. "You went crying to the principal, didn't you? Trying to make me look bad." Ethan's heart pounded. He hadn't expected the principal to confront Mr. Grayson so soon. "I wasn't trying to make you look bad," he said quietly. "I just wanted my grade to reflect my work." Mr. Grayson laughed bitterly. "Your work? You're just a kid, Ethan. You don't understand how the real world works. People like you need to learn their place." Ethan's jaw tightened. "People like me?" "Yes," Mr. Grayson sneered. "Know-it-alls who think they can outsmart their teachers. Let me give you some advice. No one likes a show-off." Ethan felt a surge of anger, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I'm not trying to show off," he said evenly. "I just want to learn." "Well, maybe you should learn to keep your head down," Mr. Grayson shot back. "Because if you keep this up, you're going to find yourself in a lot of trouble." Ethan didn't respond. He stood up, slinging his bag over his shoulder. "Are we done here?" Mr. Grayson's eyes narrowed. "Get out." By lunchtime, rumors were flying around the school. Somehow, word had gotten out about Ethan's email to the principal. As he sat alone in the cafeteria, he could feel the weight of 100 stares. Whispers followed him everywhere he went. "Did you hear?" Ethan tattled on Grayson. "Yeah, I heard he's trying to get him fired." "No way. Grayson's a jerk, but he's not going anywhere." Ethan tried to block out the noise, but it was impossible. His appetite was gone, and his chest felt tight. He was used to being invisible, but now he was the center of attention, and not in a good way. Logan appeared out of nowhere, plopping down across from him with a tray of food. "So," he said, grinning, "you really went to the principal, huh?" Ethan glared at him. "I didn't do it to start trouble. Could have fooled me," Logan said, taking a bite of his sandwich. "You know Grayson's going to make your life miserable now, right?" "I can handle it," Ethan muttered. "Sure you can," Logan said with a laugh. "But just so you know, if he comes after you, don't expect me to step in." Ethan didn't bother replying. He grabbed his tray and left, his face burning with frustration. Later that afternoon, Ethan was called to the principal's office. He felt a wave of anxiety as he walked down the hallway, his mind racing with possibilities. When he entered the office, Principal Johnson greeted him with a warm smile. "Have a seat, Ethan," she said. Ethan sat down, clutching his bag tightly. "Am I in trouble?" he asked cautiously. "Not at all," the principal replied. "I reviewed your work, and I agree with your assessment. The question on the assignment was flawed, and your explanation was very thorough." Ethan's heart lifted. "Does that mean—" "I've asked Mr. Grayson to adjust your grade," Principal Johnson said. "And I've also asked him to be more mindful when designing future assignments." Ethan felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. The principal's expression turned serious. "That being said, Ethan, I want to caution you. Mr. Grayson is a respected teacher, and this situation has made things complicated. It's important to remain respectful, even if you disagree with him." Ethan nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling that her words were more of a warning than advice. As Ethan walked back to class, he couldn't help but feel like a target had been painted on his back. The relief of having his grade corrected was overshadowed by the knowledge that Mr. Grayson wasn't going to let this go. And he was right. Ethan returned to his desk, only to find a folded note tucked into his textbook. He unfolded it and read the words scrawled in angry, jagged handwriting. "You'll regret this." Ethan's blood ran cold as he glanced around the room. Mr. Grayson was at the front, writing on the board as if nothing had happened. But Ethan knew better. This was far from over. Ethan clenched the note in his fist, his heart pounding. He glanced around the room, hoping to spot some clue as to who might have left it. The other students were busy copying notes from the board, seemingly oblivious. Mr. Grayson stood at the front, his back turned, scribbling equations on the whiteboard. Ethan tucked the note into his pocket and tried to focus on the lesson, but his mind kept drifting back to the message. It was a direct threat, and he had no doubt who it was from. The handwriting was crude, but the venom in the words mirrored Mr. Grayson's tone perfectly. Ethan was sure the teacher was behind it, but proving it would be another story. After class, Ethan stayed behind. He waited until the last student had left before approaching Mr. Grayson's desk. His palms were sweaty, and his voice trembled slightly as he spoke. "Mr. Grayson, can I talk to you?" The teacher looked up, his expression hard. "Make it quick." Ethan hesitated, then pulled the note from his pocket and placed it on the desk. "I found this in my book." Mr. Grayson's eyes flicked to the paper. His lips curved into a faint, dismissive smirk. "And I think," Ethan swallowed, "I think someone's trying to threaten me." Mr. Grayson leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Do you have any proof of who wrote it?" Ethan shook his head. "No, but—" "Then maybe you should focus on your studies instead of making baseless accusations," Mr. Grayson interrupted. He picked up the note, crumpled it into a ball, and tossed it into the trash can. "This isn't my problem." Ethan's chest tightened with frustration. "But—" "You can leave now, Ethan," Mr. Grayson said coldly. "Unless you have something else to waste my time with." Ethan bit his lip and turned to leave, anger simmering beneath his skin. He knew confronting Mr. Grayson wouldn't solve anything, but he hadn't expected the teacher to brush him off so easily. That night, Ethan sat at his desk, staring at a blank sheet of paper. He wanted to come up with a plan, some way to outsmart Mr. Grayson and prove he was behind the note. But every idea felt risky. If he pushed too hard, Mr. Grayson might retaliate even more viciously. A knock at his door broke his concentration. His mom peeked inside, smiling. "Dinner's ready." Ethan nodded, forcing a smile. "I'll be there in a minute." She paused, her expression softening. "You've been really quiet lately. Everything okay at school?" Ethan hesitated. He wanted to tell her about Mr. Grayson, about the note, about everything. But part of him was afraid she wouldn't understand. Or worse, that she'd intervene and make things worse. Yeah, he said finally. Just a lot of homework. His mom nodded. All right, but if you ever need to talk, you know I'm here, right? Yeah, Ethan said quietly. Thanks, Mom. The next day, Ethan walked into math class determined to keep his head down. But as soon as he sat at his desk, he noticed something was off. His notebook was missing. He searched his bag, his desk, even the floor, but it was nowhere to be found. Looking for something? A voice said behind him. Ethan turned to see Logan holding his notebook, a smug grin on his face. Thought I'd borrow this, Logan said, waving it in the air. You know, to see what all the fuss is about. Give it back, Ethan said, his voice low but firm. Logan laughed, flipping through the pages. Man, you're such a nerd. All these numbers, don't you ever write anything normal? I'm serious, Logan, Ethan said, his fists clenching. Give it back. Before Logan could respond, Mr. Grayson walked in. What's going on here? He demanded. Logan quickly handed the notebook back, shrugging. Nothing, sir. Just messing around. Ethan sat down, his hands shaking as he stuffed the notebook into his bag. He could feel Mr. Grayson's eyes on him, but he didn't look up. As the lesson began, Ethan noticed a subtle shift in Mr. Grayson's behavior. The teacher seemed more focused on him than usual, calling on him repeatedly and watching him with a smug expression. It was as if he was waiting for Ethan to slip up, to show weakness. By the time class ended, Ethan felt like he was walking on a tightrope, constantly on edge. As he packed up his things, Mr. Grayson approached his desk. Ethan, he said, his tone almost pleasant. Can I see you for a moment? Ethan's stomach churned, but he nodded and followed Mr. Grayson to his desk. The teacher leaned against it, folding his arms. You've been causing quite a stir lately, he said. I haven't done anything wrong, Ethan replied, his voice steady. Mr. Grayson's smile was cold. That's debatable. But let me give you some advice. No one likes a troublemaker. If you keep this up, you're going to find yourself in a very uncomfortable position. Ethan felt a surge of defiance. I just want to be treated fairly. Mr. Grayson's smile faded. For a moment, his expression was unreadable. Then he leaned closer, lowering his voice. Fairness doesn't exist, Ethan. The sooner you understand that, the better. That night, Ethan decided he'd had enough. He pulled out his phone and started recording a voice memo, documenting everything that had happened. The note, the missing notebook, Mr. Grayson's behavior. He didn't know what he would do with it yet, but he wanted to have a record, just in case. The next morning, Ethan arrived at school early. He went straight to the library and logged into one of the computers. He started typing an email to the school board, laying out everything he'd experienced. He attached a copy of the voice memo and hesitated for a moment before hitting send. When Ethan walked into math class, he felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. He had taken a risk, and he didn't know what the consequences would be. But one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let Mr. Grayson bully him anymore. Ethan noticed Mr. Grayson standing at the front of the room, his face pale and his hands trembling slightly as he looked at his phone. It was clear he had received the email, and Ethan knew the battle was about to escalate. Mr. Grayson's expression was a storm of emotions, confusion, anger, and barely concealed panic. His hands trembled as he set his phone down on the desk, his gaze scanning the room until it landed on Ethan. Their eyes met, and for a fleeting moment, Mr. Grayson's mask slipped, revealing the fury beneath. Ethan felt his pulse quicken, but kept his face neutral. He wasn't going to back down. Settle down, Mr. Grayson barked, louder than usual. The class, already tense, immediately quieted. He began the lesson, but his delivery was off. His voice shook slightly, and he stumbled over words. He was clearly distracted, and Ethan knew why. The email had reached him, and it was only a matter of time before the fallout began. After class, Ethan packed his bag quickly, hoping to leave before Mr. Grayson could corner him. But as he reached the door, the teacher's voice stopped him. Ethan. A word. Ethan turned, keeping his expression calm. The classroom was empty now, the air thick with tension. Mr. Grayson gestured for him to approach the desk. Ethan hesitated, but finally walked over, gripping the strap of his backpack tightly. "Sit down," Mr. Grayson said, his tone clipped. Ethan sat, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what to expect, but he braced himself for the worst. "What exactly are you trying to accomplish?" Mr. Grayson asked, his voice low and sharp. Ethan met his gaze. "I want to be treated fairly." "Fairly?" Mr. Grayson leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. "You think running to the principal, the school board, and whoever else you emailed is going to get you fairness?" Ethan didn't flinch. "I don't think bullying me is fair either." Mr. Grayson's face darkened. For a moment, he looked like he might explode, but then he forced a cold smile. "You've made a big mistake, Ethan." "I don't think I have," Ethan replied, his voice steady despite the fear twisting in his stomach. The teacher's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Let me tell you how this ends. You'll make a fuss, people will listen for a little while, but then they'll move on. I'll still be here. And you? You'll be forgotten." Ethan stood up, his resolve strengthening. "We'll see." He turned and walked out of the classroom, his heart racing. The confrontation had left him shaken, but it also fueled his determination. Mr. Grayson wasn't untouchable, and Ethan was going to prove it. That afternoon, during lunch, Ethan sat alone in the library, reviewing the voice memo he'd recorded the night before. He debated whether to share it with the principal or keep it as a backup. As he listened, he felt a tap on his shoulder. Startled, he turned to see Logan standing there, looking uncharacteristically serious. "What do you want?" Ethan asked, narrowing his eyes. Logan slid into the seat across from him. "Relax. I'm not here to mess with you." "Then why are you here?" Logan hesitated, his usual smug demeanor replaced by something that almost looked like concern. "Look, I heard what's going on with Grayson. You're really going after him, huh?" Ethan nodded. "He's not going to get away with it." Logan scratched the back of his neck. "Yeah, about that. You should be careful. Grayson's got connections. My brother had him a few years ago, and he got into a fight with Grayson over something stupid. Guess who ended up in detention for a month, while Grayson came out squeaky clean?" Ethan frowned. "That's not going to happen this time." Logan leaned back, crossing his arms. "Maybe, but just so you know, Grayson's not the kind of guy to play fair. You might be smart, but he's got years of experience covering his tracks." Ethan stared at him, unsure of what to say. Was Logan genuinely trying to warn him, or was this some kind of game? "Why do you care?" Ethan asked finally. Logan shrugged. "I don't, but it'd suck if you went through all this trouble just to get squashed." Ethan sighed. "Thanks for the warning, but I'm not backing down." Logan nodded, a faint smirk returning to his face. "Suit yourself, Einstein. Just don't say I didn't warn you." Later that evening, Ethan received an email from Principal Johnson, asking him to meet in her office the following morning. The message was polite but curt, and Ethan couldn't tell whether it was good or bad news. He spent the rest of the night preparing himself, going over his notes and the voice recording one more time. When the morning came, Ethan walked into the principal's office with his head held high. Principal Johnson greeted him with a nod and gestured for him to sit. To his surprise, Mr. Grayson was already there, sitting stiffly with his arms crossed. His expression was a mix of anger and discomfort. "Ethan," the principal began, "I've reviewed your email, as well as the documentation you provided. I've also spoken with Mr. Grayson about your concerns." Ethan glanced at the teacher, who avoided his gaze. After careful consideration, Principal Johnson continued, "I've decided to involve the district office in this matter. They will be conducting an independent review to ensure that everything is handled appropriately." Ethan's heart leapt. He hadn't expected the situation to escalate so quickly, but he was relieved to know that someone was taking his concerns seriously. Mr. Grayson's voice cut through the moment like a knife. "With all due respect, Principal Johnson, I think this is unnecessary. This is just a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by a student who doesn't understand the pressures of teaching." Ethan clenched his fists. "It's not a misunderstanding. You've been bullying me since the first day of school." "Enough," Principal Johnson said firmly, silencing them both. She turned to Mr. Grayson. "I understand your concerns, but this matter is out of my hands now. The district will decide how to proceed. The tension in the room was palpable. Ethan felt a surge of victory, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this wasn't over. Not yet. As Ethan left the office, he couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Grayson was plotting his next move. The teacher had been cornered, but he wasn't the type to give up without a fight. Ethan walked back to class, his thoughts racing. As he passes by the teacher's lounge, he overhears Mr. Grayson's voice, low and angry. If that kid thinks he's won, he has no idea what's coming. Ethan freezes, his pulse quickening. Whatever Mr. Grayson was planning, it was going to be big, and Ethan knew he had to be ready. Ethan hurried down the hallway, his mind racing. Mr. Grayson's words echoed in his head. If that kid thinks he's won, he has no idea what's coming. The threat was clear, and Ethan knew he couldn't afford to let his guard down. He slipped into his next class, trying to act normal, but his nerves were on edge. The rest of the day passed in a blur of whispered conversations and uneasy glances. By the time the final bell rang, Ethan felt like he'd run a marathon. As he packed his bag to leave, Logan appeared at his side. "Hey, Einstein," Logan said, leaning against the desk. "Heard about the meeting with the principal. How'd it go?" Ethan hesitated, debating whether to tell him the truth. "The district's getting involved," he said finally. "They're going to investigate." Logan whistled. "Wow, you've got guts. I'll give you that. But you know Grayson's not going to just roll over, right?" "I know," Ethan said quietly. "But I'm not giving up." Logan nodded, a faint smirk on his face. "Well, good luck. You're gonna need it." The next morning, Ethan walked into school with a sinking feeling. He couldn't explain it, but something felt off. As he made his way to his locker, he noticed students whispering and glancing at him. By the time he reached his destination, his stomach was in knots. He opened his locker and froze. Inside, his belongings were covered in red paint. A note was taped to the door, the words scrawled in bold, jagged letters. "Stop making trouble." Ethan's heart sank. He stepped back, his hands trembling. The hallway grew quieter as more students noticed the scene, their whispers growing louder. "Whoa," Logan said, appearing beside him. "That's intense." Ethan swallowed hard, his face burning with humiliation. "Who did this?" "Gee, I wonder," Logan said sarcastically, nodding toward the teacher's lounge. "You gonna report it?" Ethan clenched his fists. "Of course." Logan shrugged. "Your funeral, man. Grayson's not gonna let this slide." Ignoring him, Ethan marched to the principal's office, his anger outweighing his fear. When he arrived, Principal Johnson looked up from her desk, startled by his expression. "Ethan, what's wrong?" she asked. Ethan placed the note on her desk, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "Someone vandalized my locker." The principal's eyes widened as she read the note. "I see," she said, her tone serious. "Do you have any idea who might be responsible?" Ethan hesitated. He didn't have concrete proof, but he couldn't ignore the timing, or Mr. Grayson's earlier threat. "I think it was Mr. Grayson," he said finally. Principal Johnson's expression shifted, a mix of surprise and skepticism. "That's a serious accusation, Ethan." "I know," Ethan said, his voice firm, "but he's been targeting me for weeks. This can't be a coincidence." The principal leaned back in her chair, her gaze thoughtful. "I'll investigate this further. In the meantime, I'll have the janitor clean your locker. Thank you for bringing this to my attention." Ethan nodded, but he left the office feeling uneasy. He knew the principal meant well, but he couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't fully believe him. That afternoon, as Ethan walked home, his phone buzzed with a new email. He opened it and felt his stomach drop. Subject: Final warning. Ethan, I suggest you drop this matter immediately. You're digging yourself into a hole you won't be able to climb out of. Consider this your last chance. There was no signature, but Ethan didn't need one to know who had sent it. His hands shook as he reread the message, his anger bubbling to the surface. Mr. Grayson was trying to intimidate him, but Ethan refused to back down. He forwarded the email to Principal Johnson, adding a short message of his own. "This is what I'm dealing with. Please take this seriously." The following day, Ethan arrived at school to find the principal waiting for him outside his first class. Her expression was grim, and Ethan's heart sank. "Ethan, can I speak with you for a moment?" she asked. Ethan nodded, following her to a quiet corner of the hallway. "Is this about the email?" he asked. Principal Johnson nodded. "Yes. I've shared it with the district office, and they're taking it very seriously." However, she hesitated, her expression troubled. "Mr. Grayson is denying any involvement. He claims the email was forged." Ethan's jaw tightened. "He's lying." "I believe you," the principal said gently. "But without concrete evidence, it's your word against his. That's why I need you to be careful. Don't engage with him directly, and report anything suspicious immediately." Ethan nodded, though frustration gnawed at him. He hated feeling powerless, but he knew he couldn't give up. By lunchtime, the tension in the school was palpable. Word of the vandalism and the email had spread, and everyone seemed to be talking about it. Ethan sat alone in the library, trying to focus on his homework, when Logan appeared again. "Man, you're like a magnet for drama," Logan said, sitting across from him. "You really think Grayson's behind all this?" "I don't think," Ethan said quietly. "I know," Logan whistled. "Well, you've got guts. I'll give you that. But don't you think you're poking the bear a little too hard?" Ethan shook his head. "He's the one who started this. I'm just standing up for myself." "Yeah, well, just be careful," Logan said. "Grayson's not the type to play fair." Ethan nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He needed a way to prove that Mr. Grayson was behind the threats and the vandalism. But how? That night, Ethan sat at his desk, poring over every interaction he'd had with Mr. Grayson. He replayed the voice memo he'd recorded, looking for any detail he might have missed. Suddenly, an idea struck him. He grabbed his phone and began researching recording devices. If he could capture Mr. Grayson in the act, making a threat or admitting to the vandalism, he'd have undeniable proof. Ethan stared at a discreet recording pin on his computer screen, his finger hovering over the Buy Now button. He knew it was risky, but it might be his only chance to expose Mr. Grayson once and for all. With a deep breath, he clicked the button, setting his plan into motion. The package arrived 2 days later. Ethan tore it open in his room, revealing the sleek recording pin nestled inside. He turned it over in his hands, marveling at how ordinary it looked. Just a simple black pin with a hidden microphone. It felt strange holding something so small that had the potential to change everything. He spent the evening learning how to use it, testing its recording quality and figuring out how to switch it on and off discreetly. By the time he was done, he felt confident. Now all he needed was the right moment. The next day at school, Ethan slipped the pin into the front pocket of his shirt and walked into math class. Mr. Grayson greeted the students with his usual cold demeanor, but Ethan could sense the undercurrent of tension in his movements. The teacher avoided looking at him, which only made Ethan more suspicious. Throughout the lesson, Ethan stayed alert, waiting for any sign that Mr. Grayson might slip up. But the teacher was unusually careful, sticking strictly to the lesson plan and avoiding any interactions with Ethan. By the time the bell rang, Ethan felt frustrated. He couldn't record evidence if Mr. Grayson refused to engage. As the class filed out, Mr. Grayson called out, "Ethan, stay behind for a moment." Ethan's heart skipped a beat, but he nodded and stayed seated as the door closed behind the last student. Mr. Grayson walked over to his desk, his expression unreadable. "I assume you know why I asked you to stay," Mr. Grayson said, leaning against his desk. Ethan activated the pin in his pocket with a subtle click. "No, sir," he said, keeping his voice neutral. Mr. Grayson's lips twitched into a faint smile. "I've been informed about your claims. The emails, the locker incident. Quite the imagination you have." Ethan tensed but stayed quiet. "Let me make something clear," Mr. Grayson continued, his tone sharpening. "You're walking a very fine line. If you keep this up, you'll find yourself in a situation you can't talk your way out of." Ethan's pulse quickened. "Are you threatening me?" Mr. Grayson chuckled, a low, humorless sound. "Of course not. I'm simply giving you some advice. Focus on your studies and stop making waves. It's for your own good." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I just want to be treated fairly." And I want to teach in peace, Mr. Grayson snapped, his composure slipping for the first time. But here we are. He straightened, brushing invisible dust off his shirt. This conversation is over. Go to your next class. Ethan stood, his legs shaky. As he walked out of the room, he couldn't help but feel a small sense of triumph. The pin had captured everything. That evening, Ethan played back the recording on his computer. The sound was clear, and every word of Mr. Grayson's veiled threats was unmistakable. Ethan's heart pounded as he listened, a mixture of relief and determination flooding through him. He finally had proof. But as he sat there, a nagging thought crept into his mind. Would this be enough? Mr. Grayson hadn't admitted to the vandalism or the emails, and his words, while threatening, were carefully chosen. Ethan needed more, something that would leave no room for doubt. The next day, Ethan arrived at school early. He waited near the teacher's lounge, his recording pin at the ready. He knew it was risky, but he was hoping to catch Mr. Grayson off guard, perhaps talking to another teacher about what had happened. After a few minutes, he saw Mr. Grayson enter the lounge, a coffee mug in hand. Ethan slipped closer, positioning himself near the slightly ajar door. Voices drifted out, muffled but audible. Blown out of proportion, Mr. Grayson was saying, "The kid's just trying to ruin my reputation. You've been under a lot of scrutiny lately," another teacher replied. "Maybe you should just back off for now." "I can't," Mr. Grayson snapped. "If I let him win, every student will think they can walk all over me." "But what if the district finds something?" the other voice asked cautiously. "It could backfire." Mr. Grayson laughed bitterly. "They won't find anything. I've made sure of that." Ethan's heart raced as he listened, holding his breath to avoid making any noise. He leaned closer, trying to hear more, but the door creaked under his weight. The voices stopped abruptly. "Hello?" Mr. Grayson called out, his tone sharp. Ethan bolted, his heart pounding in his ears. He didn't stop running until he reached the far end of the hallway, ducking into an empty classroom to catch his breath. He pulled out the pin, his hands trembling. If it had captured the conversation, it might be the break he needed. That afternoon, Ethan listened to the recording. The quality wasn't as good as the previous one, but Mr. Grayson's words were clear enough. "They won't find anything. I've made sure of that." It was vague, but it hinted at wrongdoing. Combined with the first recording, it might be enough to force the district to take action. Ethan transferred the files to his computer and composed a new email, attaching both recordings. He hesitated for a moment, his finger hovering over the send button. This was it, his chance to expose Mr. Grayson once and for all. With a deep breath, he clicked send. The next morning, Ethan was called to the principal's office again. This time, the atmosphere was different. Principal Johnson looked both serious and concerned, and sitting across from her was a man Ethan didn't recognize, wearing a suit and holding a briefcase. "Ethan, this is Mr. Caldwell," Principal Johnson said. "He's from the district office." Ethan sat down, his palms sweaty. Mr. Caldwell offered a polite smile. "Ethan, we've reviewed the recordings you sent. Thank you for bringing this to our attention. I'd like to ask you a few questions about your interactions with Mr. Grayson." Ethan nodded, his heart pounding as he recounted everything. The unfair grading, the threats, the vandalism, and the emails. He answered Mr. Caldwell's questions as clearly as he could, feeling a mix of relief and anxiety. By the end of the meeting, he felt like he had done everything in his power. As he left the office, Ethan noticed Mr. Grayson being escorted down the hallway by another district official. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Ethan saw the unmistakable fury in the teacher's expression. Mr. Grayson leaned in close to the official escorting him, muttering something under his breath. Ethan couldn't hear the words, but the look Mr. Grayson shot him as he disappeared around the corner made one thing clear. This wasn't over. Ethan sat at his desk, trying to focus on his homework, but his thoughts were scattered. Mr. Grayson's glare as he was escorted away replayed in his mind like a warning. The district was involved now, and the recordings had made an impact, but Ethan knew the fight wasn't over. He didn't trust Mr. Grayson to accept defeat quietly. The next day at school, the atmosphere was strange. Students whispered in the hallways, some casting curious glances at Ethan. Word of Mr. Grayson's removal had spread fast, though the details were murky. Some said he was fired, others claimed he was just under investigation. Ethan didn't know the truth, and part of him didn't want to. As he reached his locker, he hesitated, half expecting another cruel message or act of vandalism. But the locker was clean, and everything inside was untouched. It felt like a small victory, but it didn't erase the lingering tension. "Hey, Einstein." Logan's voice broke through Ethan's thoughts. He leaned against the lockers, his usual smirk in place. "So, you really got Grayson out, huh?" Ethan shrugged. "It's not over yet. The district is still investigating." Logan nodded, crossing his arms. "Yeah, but you made a statement. People are talking." "Good," Ethan said, his tone firm. "Maybe they'll think twice before letting someone like him get away with stuff like that again." Logan raised an eyebrow. "Careful, dude. Pride comes before the fall, or whatever. Grayson's not the type to go down without a fight." Ethan sighed. "I know." By lunchtime, Ethan's unease grew. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing, though he couldn't pinpoint what. As he sat alone in the library, scrolling through his phone, he received an email notification from an unfamiliar address. The subject line made his blood run cold. "You think you've won?" Ethan opened the email, his hands shaking. The message was short but chilling. "You're just a kid. You don't know who you're messing with. This isn't over." There was no name, but Ethan didn't need one to know it was from Mr. Grayson. His heart raced as he stared at the screen. How was this possible? The teacher was supposed to be under investigation. How could he still be contacting him? Ethan forwarded the email to Principal Johnson and the district office immediately, adding a brief note explaining that he believed it was from Mr. Grayson. He hit send and sat back, trying to calm the storm of anxiety in his chest. Later that afternoon, Ethan was called to the principal's office again. When he walked in, Principal Johnson and Mr. Caldwell were waiting for him. Both of them looked serious, their faces tense. "Ethan," Principal Johnson began, gesturing for him to sit. "We received your email. Thank you for reporting this. Have you traced it?" Ethan asked, his voice steady despite the fear creeping into his chest. "We're working on it," Mr. Caldwell replied. "The message was sent from a private account, but we forwarded it to our IT department for further investigation. If it's linked to Mr. Grayson, it will strengthen the case against him." Ethan nodded, but the knot in his stomach tightened. What happens if it's not him? Mr. Caldwell's expression softened. "If that's the case, we'll explore other possibilities. Either way, you've done the right thing by bringing it to our attention." Principal Johnson leaned forward, her gaze firm. "Ethan, I know this is difficult, but I want to assure you that we're taking this seriously. If you feel unsafe or notice anything unusual, please let us know immediately." Ethan nodded again, but as he left the office, a sense of dread settled over him. The email felt like a direct threat, and it confirmed what he already knew. Mr. Grayson wasn't going to let this go quietly. That night, Ethan sat at his computer, scrolling through news articles about teacher misconduct cases. Many of them ended in resolutions, but some dragged on for years, with the students involved facing relentless backlash. The thought made him uneasy. He didn't want to spend the rest of middle school as the kid who got the teacher fired. A sudden sound startled him, a soft tapping at his window. Ethan froze, his heart pounding. Slowly, he turned his head, staring at the glass. It was dark outside, but he could just make out a faint shadow moving near the bushes. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He grabbed his phone and crept toward the window, his hands shaking. As he peeked through the curtains, the shadow shifted, and for a moment, he thought he saw a face. But before he could get a better look, the figure darted away, disappearing into the night. Ethan's fingers fumbled as he dialed 911. His voice shook as he explained what had happened, and within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the air. 2 officers arrived, searching the yard and the surrounding area, but they found nothing. "You're sure you saw someone?" one of the officers asked. Ethan nodded. "I think so. It was dark, but there was definitely someone out there." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner. "We'll patrol the area for a while. If you see or hear anything else, call us immediately." Ethan thanked them and watched as they left, their car disappearing into the night. He locked all the doors and windows, his nerves on edge. He didn't know if the figure outside was connected to Mr. Grayson, but the timing was too coincidental to ignore. The next morning, Ethan arrived at school feeling exhausted but determined. He wasn't going to let fear control him. As he walked into math class, the substitute teacher greeted him with a warm smile. "Good morning, Ethan," she said. "I heard you've been through a lot lately. If there's anything I can do to help, just let me know." Ethan nodded, appreciating her kindness but unsure how to respond. He took his seat and pulled out his notebook, trying to focus on the lesson. But as the substitute began writing on the board, Ethan noticed something out of the corner of his eye. A piece of paper was tucked under his textbook, folded neatly. He hesitated, his heart pounding as he reached for it. Unfolding the note, he read the words written in a familiar, jagged scrawl. "You're being watched." Ethan gripped the note, his mind racing as he scanned the room. The substitute continued teaching, oblivious to the turmoil unfolding at Ethan's desk. Whoever was behind this wasn't done, and Ethan knew the next move would be even more dangerous. Ethan sat frozen, staring at the note in his hands. "You're being watched." The words felt like a cold hand gripping his chest. He glanced around the classroom, searching for anyone who might be watching him, but his classmates seemed engrossed in the lesson. If someone had left the note, they had done so with unnerving precision. The substitute noticed Ethan's distracted expression. "Ethan, is everything all right?" He quickly folded the note and shoved it into his pocket. "I'm fine," he mumbled, though his trembling hands betrayed him. At lunch, Ethan found a quiet corner of the library to think. He pulled out the note and studied it, his mind racing. The handwriting matched the earlier threats, and though he couldn't prove it, he felt certain Mr. Grayson was behind this. But how? The teacher was supposed to be under investigation. Was someone helping him? Or was Mr. Grayson acting through someone else? Ethan decided he couldn't handle this alone. He forwarded a photo of the note to Principal Johnson, adding a short message. "Another threat. Found this in class today. Please help." By the end of the day, Ethan was called to the principal's office again. This time, Mr. Caldwell and a security officer were waiting with Principal Johnson. "Ethan, thank you for reporting this," Principal Johnson said, her tone serious. "We've been investigating the emails and notes, and we believe we're getting closer to identifying the source." Ethan's pulse quickened. "Do you think it's Mr. Grayson?" Mr. Caldwell sighed. "It's complicated. The email account used for the threats was set up under a false name, but we've traced the IP address to an internet cafe near his home. While this isn't definitive proof, it's highly suspicious." The security officer leaned forward. "We've also increased surveillance on school grounds. If anyone attempts to approach you or your belongings, we'll catch them." Ethan nodded, grateful for their support but still feeling uneasy. "What about the notes? How are they getting into my stuff?" Principal Johnson frowned. "That's what we're trying to figure out. For now, keep a close eye on your belongings and report anything unusual." The next few days passed uneventfully, but the tension lingered. Ethan felt like he was constantly looking over his shoulder, waiting for the next threat. He kept the recording pin with him at all times, determined to capture anything suspicious. Then, one evening, the breakthrough came. Ethan's phone buzzed with a notification from the district office. The email contained a video attachment and a brief message. "We thought you should see this." Ethan opened the video with trembling hands. It was grainy security footage from the school, showing the hallway outside his classroom. He fast-forwarded through the first few minutes, watching as students filed in and out. Then, at the 2-minute mark, his breath caught. Mr. Grayson appeared on the screen. Though he was no longer allowed to teach, he had somehow gained access to the building. He looked around cautiously before slipping into Ethan's classroom. Less than a minute later, he emerged, his hands empty but his posture stiff with urgency. Ethan knew, without a doubt, that this was when Mr. Grayson had planted the note. The following morning, Ethan arrived at school to find a buzz of activity. Teachers whispered in the hallways, and the students seemed unusually animated. He didn't have to wait long to find out why. During the first class, Principal Johnson made an announcement over the intercom. "Attention, students and staff. We wanted to inform you that, effective immediately, Mr. Grayson is no longer employed by Lincoln Middle School. Any questions or concerns regarding this matter can be directed to the principal's office. Thank you. The classroom erupted in whispers, but Ethan sat in stunned silence. It was over. Mr. Grayson had been caught. After school, Principal Johnson called Ethan to her office one last time. She smiled warmly as he entered, gesturing for him to sit. Ethan, I wanted to personally thank you for your bravery. It's not easy to stand up to someone in a position of authority, but because of you, we were able to take action. Ethan nodded, a mixture of relief and exhaustion washing over him. So, he's gone? Yes, Principal Johnson said. The district has terminated his employment, and he's been banned from school property. The authorities are also looking into potential charges related to the threats. Ethan let out a shaky breath. I just wanted it to stop. And you made it stop, Principal Johnson said firmly. You've shown incredible strength through all of this. I hope you know how proud we are of you. That evening, Ethan walked home feeling lighter than he had in weeks. For the first time, he felt safe, like he could finally move on. When he got home, he opened his notebook and began sketching out a new math problem, losing himself in the comfort of numbers. As he worked, a thought crossed his mind. Standing up for himself had been terrifying, but it had also been worth it. He had proven that even quiet voices could be powerful when they spoke the truth. Ethan smiled to himself, the pencil moving confidently across the page. He didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but he knew one thing for certain. He was ready for them.